The rope was empty, but waiting. Snow fell slowly, as if the sky itself mourned the injustice pressing down on the small town of Ravenwood Creek. The flakes drifted in lazy spirals, settling on the shoulders of the crowd gathered in the town square, dusting the wooden platform and melting against the single rope that hung from the gallows, empty but patient. Clara Whitmore stood beneath it. Her wrists were bound so tightly that the ropes had long since cut through skin, and a thin line of dried blood traced the inside of her palms. 3 hours she had stood there in the bitter cold, her breath coming in small white clouds, while the townspeople argued over her fate as though she were a piece of disputed property rather than a living woman. She had stopped shivering. That frightened her more than the cold itself. "Hang the witch!" The voice tore through the crowd like a blade, and others picked it up, weaving it into a chant that rose and fell with the wind. Clara did not flinch. She had made a decision somewhere around the second hour that she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. She had kept promises harder than this. She had survived worse roads than this one. But she was still human, and human hearts still search for familiar faces even when they know better. Her eyes moved across the crowd, past angry strangers, past curious children perched on fences, past women who had once smiled at her in the general store, until they found him, Ethan Cole. He stood half hidden in the shadow of the saloon's awning, his broad shoulders hunched, his hat pulled low. He was the only man in Ravenwood Creek who knew exactly what had happened. He was the only man who could end this with a few honest words. Their eyes met. For one long, terrible moment, Clara let herself hope. Then he looked away. Something broke inside her chest, not loudly, not dramatically, the way things break in stories. It broke the way river ice cracks in early spring, a quiet splitting sound deep beneath the surface that signals the whole structure is about to give way. She turned her face forward and breathed. Vernon Blackwell climbed the platform with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his life feared consequences. He was dressed impeccably, a wool coat with a fur collar, polished boots, a silver-tipped cane that he used more for effect than support. He surveyed the crowd with the comfortable authority of someone who owned most of what they could see. He was, by every outward measure, a gentleman of standing. Clara knew precisely what he was beneath that coat. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was smooth, practiced, designed to sound reasonable. "I want you to know that despite everything, I bear you no personal malice. You are a troubled woman who made a terrible choice, but it is not too late." He tilted his head slightly. "Confess that you stole my cousin's child. Tell the truth before God and these witnesses. Do that, and I will personally advocate for mercy. Prison instead of the noose." He spread his hands as though offering her a gift. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she knew, the letters she had read, the story Elizabeth had told her in whispers, the night James Harrington had pressed a leather satchel into his wife's hands and said, "Take the baby and run, and don't stop running." She thought about what it would mean to confess to something she had not done. She thought about Rose, and she smiled, not kindly. "Go to hell, Vernon." The crowd inhaled sharply as one body. Blackwell's cultivated calm shattered instantly. Color flooded his face, and for just a moment before he reassembled his expression, Clara saw the real man, small, vicious, and terrified of being exposed. "How dare you?" "My courage is far greater than you think," Clara said, and she raised her voice so that it carried across the square, above the wind, above the murmuring crowd. I know your truth. I know what you did to your cousin James when he refused to sell you the Harrington mining rights. I know about the threats. I know about the men you hired. I know you had the Harrington house set on fire in the dead of winter, hoping the whole family would burn in their sleep so you could inherit everything they refused to give you. For 3 seconds, the square was absolutely silent. Then Blackwell's hand struck her face so hard that her head snapped sideways, and she tasted blood where her lips split open against her teeth. "Liar," he said, his voice low and shaking with rage. "You think anyone in this town will believe a word from your mouth? You are nothing. A drifter, a woman with no family, no land, no reputation. You invented these fantasies because you are desperate." "The letters exist," Clara said quietly, blood running warm over her chin. "Elizabeth wrote everything down before they separated, and there is a witness who has read those letters." She did not look at Ethan. She did not need to. She could feel him from across the square, feel the particular stillness of a man who is trying very hard not to move, not to breathe, not to be seen. "Please," she prayed, not to God this time, but to whatever remaining piece of the man she had trusted still lived inside Ethan Cole. "Please be brave. Not for me. I know you cannot do it for me. Do it for Rose. Do it so that little girl does not grow up in the house of the man who murdered her parents." But when she glanced his way, Ethan was a statue, frozen in shadow, as though if he stood still enough, the moment would pass around him without touching him. Sheriff Paulson stepped forward with a worn Bible pressed to his chest and the resigned expression of a man performing a duty he found distasteful but would not refuse. "Clara Whitmore, you have been found guilty by the citizens of Ravenwood Creek of the crime of child abduction and fraud upon the court. The sentence is death by hanging." He cleared his throat. "You are afforded the opportunity to speak any last words before the sentence is carried out." Clara turned to where Mrs. Henderson stood at the edge of the crowd, holding a small dark-haired girl who was straining toward the platform with both arms outstretched, her face crumpled with a grief too large and too old for a 5-year-old's features. "I love you, little sparrow," Clara said, and her voice did not waver. "I kept my promise to your mother. I kept you safe. Whatever happens today, you remember that. You were loved from the moment you came into this world, and you will be loved every day that follows." Rose sobbed and reached harder, and Mrs. Henderson turned away, and Clara faced forward. Paulson cleared his throat again. "Very well. Vernon Blackwell, as the child's only identified living relative, custody of Rose Harrington will be granted to—" "No!" The word did not so much interrupt as detonate. It came from the edge of the crowd, and it came with enough force that people stepped back instinctively, the way they step back from a gunshot. Every head turned, and Ethan Cole walked forward. He did not look like a man who had made a comfortable decision. He looked like a man who had been dragged to the edge of a cliff by something larger than himself and had finally simply stopped fighting it. His face was pale, his hands were shaking visibly, but his eyes were clear, and his voice when he spoke again did not break. "She's innocent. Clara Whitmore is innocent, and I can prove it." He climbed the platform steps without asking permission and pulled a leather satchel from inside his coat. His hands fumbled with the clasp. Nerves, Clara realized, and something. "Harrington's situation must be resolved permanently. Do whatever is necessary. Payment Upon completion, the color had drained entirely from Blackwell's face. He looked for the first time like what he was, a frightened man at the end of a very long rope of his own making. "You're lying," he said, but it was barely a whisper. "Then perhaps," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, "you can explain it to me directly." The crowd parted. A tall man in a territorial marshal's uniform rode through the gap on a gray horse, 4 armed deputies flanking him. He was not a dramatic figure, no ornamentation, no performance, just a lean, weathered man with steady eyes who surveyed the gallows platform with the particular calm of someone who had seen worse situations and resolved them. "Territorial Marshal James Thornton," he said. "I have been conducting an investigation into Marcus Eldridge's land fraud operations for approximately 6 months. The investigation stalled repeatedly because evidence kept disappearing and witnesses kept losing their nerve." He glanced at Ethan with something that was not quite approval, but was something adjacent to it. "5 days ago, a man rode into my office in the Capitol, having traveled 3 days without proper rest, and presented me with enough documentation to complete our case." He dismounted. "Mr. Cole," he said simply, "you kept your word." Clara turned to look at Ethan, and found him already looking at her. His face held everything: guilt and relief and grief and something fragile that she did not yet have a name for. "I panicked," he said, and he was talking only to her now, as though the crowd had ceased to exist. "When I first found Elizabeth's letter, I understood immediately what it meant, what speaking up would mean, for me, for my business, for everything I'd built." His voice dropped lower. "I hid it. I told myself I needed time to think, and then days became weeks, and weeks became months, and every day I didn't speak made the next day harder." He reached forward and began working at the ropes on her wrists. "Then they arrested you, and every day you sat in that cell knowing the truth and watching me say nothing." He stopped. "I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't look at myself in any mirror." His hands stilled on the rope. "So 5 days ago, I went to the mine. I found everything Elizabeth hid, and then I rode for the Capitol, and I didn't stop until I found the marshal and told him everything." The ropes fell away. Clara held her wounded hands up and looked at them for a moment. The raw skin, the dried blood, the marks that would scar. Then she looked at Ethan. "Forgive me," he whispered. "You came back," she said. "Too late. I almost—" "You came back," she said again, more firmly, as though this were the only fact that mattered. And perhaps, she thought, it was. She held his face in her damaged hands and kissed him there on the platform in front of the entire assembled town of Ravenwood Creek, with blood still drying on her lip and snow still falling on her shoulders. When they separated, she was smiling. "Make me a promise," she said. "No more silence, no more waiting until the cost feels bearable. From this moment, truth, whatever it takes." "From this moment," he said, "whatever it takes." Marshal Thornton stepped toward Blackwell with the unhurried authority of a man who had done this many times and found no pleasure in it. "Vernon Blackwell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, arson." What happened next happened very fast. Blackwell's hand plunged into his coat and emerged with a small pistol. In the same motion, he seized Rose from Mrs. Henderson's arms, and before anyone could react, the gun was pressed against the child's temple. The crowd froze. Clara's heart stopped. Rose went rigid with a terror too old for her small body, her dark eyes finding Clara's across the square with an expression that Clara knew she would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. "Nobody moves," Blackwell said, and his voice had found some last reserve of ugliness. "I will do it. Don't think for a moment that I won't." "Vernon," Marshall Thornton's voice was utterly calm. "You harmed that child, and there is no negotiation, no deal, no mercy anywhere in this territory. There will only be a rope." "There's already a rope waiting for me. You think I don't know that?" "There was always going to be a rope waiting for you," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Blackwell's eyes snapped to her. "The fire was your idea. James Harrington found the forged deeds and threatened to go to the authorities, and you decided that threats weren't enough anymore. You told Eldridge it needed to end, and Eldridge gave you permission, and you felt powerful. Powerful enough to burn a family alive in their home." "Shut up." "But Elizabeth got out. She got Rose out, and James made it far enough to hide the evidence before they caught him." She took one step forward. "You've been terrified for 4 years that someone would find what he hid. That's what this was really about, wasn't it? Not Rose. You don't care about Rose. You wanted her close so you could control what she might someday remember or say." "Shut up." His gun hand was trembling. "You hired men to frame me, because a lone woman with no family and no land is the easiest possible person to make disappear. You thought if I hanged, the questions would hang with me." She took another step. "But the letters still exist. The diary still exists. The mine still exists. Vernon, it's over. It was over the moment you sent that telegram." Blackwell's face had gone through several transformations: rage, then calculation, then something that looked almost like the realization of a man understanding for the first time that he has genuinely run out of road. His gun arm wavered, and Ethan moved. 3 strides. He crossed the distance between the platform and Blackwell in 3 strides and caught the man's wrist with both hands as the gun discharged, the shot going wide into the snow. They struggled, briefly, brutally, and then Ethan's greater height and desperation won, and he drove Blackwell face first into the frozen ground and pinned him there, one knee in his back, both of the man's arms immobilized. "You would have killed her," Ethan said, breathing hard. "You would have hanged an innocent woman, stolen a child, and then gone home and slept without a single troubled dream, because that's what you are." The deputies moved in. Rose was on the ground but unharmed, and Mrs. Henderson scooped her up instantly, pressing the child's face against her shoulder, murmuring comfort. Rose was shaking but unhurt. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, not from weakness. She had held herself upright for 3 hours through will alone, but because her holding was finally unnecessary, and her body needed to feel the ground beneath her. Ethan climbed the platform steps and knelt beside her. He untied the last of the rope from her wrists with careful, steady hands. Then he looked at the marks the ropes had left and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. "You came back," she said a 3rd time, softly. "I'll spend a long time making up for how late I came." "Then we'd better start," she said, and rose to her feet. 5 years later, spring came gently to Ravenwood Creek. The cemetery on the eastern hill was quiet in the early afternoon, filled with birdsong and the smell of thawed earth. Clara stood between 2 modest headstones, James Harrington, and beside him, Elizabeth, with Rose's small hand folded in hers. The girl was 6 years old now, with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious, observant eyes. She had her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking hard about something. "Tell me about them again, Mama Clara," she said, studying the stones with an expression that was too considered for a child, but which Clara had stopped trying to soften, because it was simply who Rose was. Clara knelt beside her in the grass. "Your mother, Elizabeth, was my cousin," she said, "the bravest woman I have ever known. When powerful men decided that your family's land and your family's future belonged to them, Elizabeth fought back. She gathered evidence. She protected your father. And when she understood that she could not win, not yet, not then, she made one final decision. She put you in my arms and said, 'Keep her safe,' and I promised her I would." "Did she cry?" Clara considered this carefully. "She did," she said, "but she did not stop moving. She cried and she did what needed to be done at the same time. That is the bravest kind of courage, not the kind where you feel no fear, but the kind where you feel everything and act anyway." "And Papa James?" "Your Papa James was the one who started pulling the thread. He was a fair man who believed that wrongs should be named and corrected. He found the forged documents, and instead of burying them, he tried to carry them to people who could act. He died trying to make the world more honest. That is not a small thing." Rose placed the wildflowers she had been carrying, a loose handful of early spring blooms, against the base of her mother's stone. She stood back and looked at them with the satisfaction of a ritual completed. Footsteps on the hill path. Ethan came up from the road carrying their 2-year-old son, Samuel, who was asleep against his shoulder, with the boneless surrender of a very small child who has decided the world can wait. "Ready?" Ethan asked. "Ready," Clara said. They walked back toward town together, the 4 of them, through the mild afternoon, through a town that had quietly rebuilt itself around a story of reckoning and survival. There were still hard nights. Clara woke sometimes from dreams of the gallows, the rope, the cold, the silence of the crowd, Ethan's averted eyes. She woke with her heart hammering and lay still in the dark, cataloging the sounds of her present life, the house settling, the children breathing, Ethan beside her. Ethan had his own wrestlings. There were days when his past cowardice pressed down on him like weather. Days he was short-tempered and then ashamed of it. Days he picked up the old diary and read his father's careful handwriting and sat alone for a long time. He had done a brave thing on the day of Clara's hanging. He knew it would never entirely cancel what came before it. He had decided, eventually, that living well with that knowledge was its own form of honesty. But the good days outnumbered the hard ones by a wide margin. Rose learned to read that winter with a focused intensity that delighted Clara and charmed every miner's child in the schoolroom. She announced at age 5 that she intended to become a judge, and no one who knew her doubted it for a moment. Samuel took his first steps toward Ethan on a Tuesday afternoon in March while Clara watched from the doorway, laughing. One evening in late summer, after the children had been settled for the night, Clara and Ethan sat together on the porch. The mountains held the last light a long time before releasing it. The town below was quiet. Fireflies moved in the garden. "Do you think they'd approve?" Ethan asked after a long silence. "Elizabeth and James, of what we've made here?" Clara thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about all serious questions. "I think Elizabeth would be grateful that Rose is loved," she said finally. "I think James would ask Rose hard questions about what she's reading and be deeply satisfied with her answers." She paused. "I think they would both be glad their daughter has a father who knows what it costs to choose truth over comfort, because he paid that cost himself." He was quiet for a moment. "She asked me last week if she's her real papa." "I know. She told me she was going to ask you." He turned to look at her. "She told you first?" "She wanted to know if it would hurt your feelings. I told her only you could answer that." Clara smiled. "What did you say?" "I told her the truth, that James Harrington was her first papa, and that he loved her enough to die trying to give her a safe world, and that I'm her papa now, and that I love her just as much, even if differently." He looked back at the mountains. And then I told her that some children have one set of parents who love them, and some children have two, and that she is the rare kind of girl who has been loved completely by all four. And she said, "I know, Papa. I'm the luckiest girl in the world." His voice was rough. Then she went back to her book. Clara laughed softly. She leaned against his shoulder. The mountains finished holding the light. The fireflies drifted. Inside the house, two children slept, one dreaming probably of horses and open country, one too small yet for dreams to have shape, only warmth and the sound of familiar voices. They had built this out of a near hanging and a cowardice repented of, and a promise made in a snow-covered square, while Clara's wrists still bore the marks of rope. They had built this out of truth spoken almost too late, and love stubborn enough to survive the almost. And that, Clara thought, leaning into the man who had chosen courage on the day it mattered most, was the most honest kind of good ending there was. Not the absence of damage, not the pretense that nothing had cost anything. Just two people and two children, and a life assembled carefully from all the broken pieces. That was enough.